Several weeks ago, Muir Island, where the rain beats down and the sea crashes against the island cliffs. The grave site of Scott Summers, also known as Cyclops, is pounded by the rain, too. When suddenly there is a rumbling, then a powerful burst of optic energy breaks up through the ground, opening the grave. There is silence. Only the rain continues to fall. Then a hand reaches up from the open grave, and Scott Summers pulls himself out.
Ow,
He utters. Several years ago, a promise made. Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Scott Summers walks down a busy city sidewalk, wearing a green suit. He can't believe that he managed to sneak away from the mansion for a little vacation time. He isn't sure what it is, but something has been drawing him to Cambridge. A voice inside his head nudging him to come here. Oh my! Someone on a bicycle suddenly calls out. Get out of my way, you fool! Another exclaims as he bumps into Cyclops, pushing past him. Oh my lord! What is that thing? A woman asks, pointing towards where a large robot is stomping through the city, roaring. A fire is ablaze at a nearby building as dozens of civilians run in fear. Run for your life! One of them calls out. There are people still inside! Another exclaims. Oh my god! Oh my god! One of them mutters, while Cyclops announces that.
those people! They need my help!
He starts to remove his suit, revealing his X-Men costume underneath, and knows that he needs to hurry before the monster brings down that school on their heads. Please, that thing is attacking the science lab? There are people in there. A woman calls out.
Don't worry, ma'am. You get yourself to safety. I'll make sure your friends get out of there in one piece.
Cyclops tells her. Cyclops arrives near the robot and fires an optic blast at it, telling himself that he needs to distract the robot and get him away from the building.
Hey, ugly! Just because you don't have no class doesn't mean you gotta wreck the school.
Cyclops calls out to the robot, who turns towards him and starts to give chase.
That's right. Follow me.
Cyclops calls out while firing more optic energy at the robot. Nearby, a middle-aged man wears a strange metal helmet and watches, annoyed.
No! That meddling mutant is going to ruin my chance at revenge.
He exclaims before calling the robot Stragon and ordering it to stop the mutant, to crush him into powder.
That man, he's controlling the robot. If I can stop him, then maybe I can end this.
Cyclops thinks to himself as he looks over at the man nearby. Cyclops dodges the robot, Stragon, as it lunges at him and thinks that he can't save anyone if this robot pounds him into a pancake. He moved closer to the other man and asks him what his game plan is here.
I was their best professor, until they decided to shut me out.
The old man responds, claiming that the students were afraid of his big ideas, so they went to the dean and had him fired.
They ruined my life.
He shouts.
They took my job and took my lab. Everything I ever cared about.
He boasts that now it is time for him to return the favor, that he will destroy their lives like they destroyed his.
They didn't destroy your life. Your pettiness did.
Cyclops declares as he fires an optic blast which strikes the professor's helmet, knocking it from his head. And, just as Cyclops thought, the robot, Stragon, falls to the ground with a loud crash.
Just as I thought. Without him to control it, the robot is nothing more than a heap of scrap metal.
Cyclops remarks as he looks over at the professor, who lies on the ground. Shortly, a police cordon has been set up and the professor is led away, while a police officer shakes Cyclops' hand and tells him that some of the other fellas on the force think mutants are a menace. But there is no denying that if he wasn't here today, these kids wouldn't have made it out of that jam alive.
Just doing my duty, officer.
Cyclops responds. Several students rush up to Cyclops, one of them thanking him. One of them exclaims that he thought they were goners for sure. Man, Professor Tierney was off his rocker, a young woman declares. Another of the students remarks that this is a shame as he was so smart. If only he tried to do good with that big old brain of his. A fourth student, a young man with brown hair and glasses, approaches Cyclops and thanks him before admitting that he was the one who ratted on Professor Tierney to the faculty. It was me he was after. You saved me, the young man utters. He then informs Cyclops that his wife and he are expecting their first child. If he killed me, if I hadn't gotten home to her, to them, thank you, he utters, throwing his arms around Cyclops, hugging him.
You're welcome.
Cyclops smiles as he hugs the young man. Tears fall down his face as he introduces himself as Paul Douek and tells Cyclops there is ever anything he can do to repay the favor, to look him up and let him know. 10 years later, A favor repaid. Boston, Massachusetts. In the dead of night.
Where'd the rest of those leftovers go?
A man with brown hair, wearing a singlet, mutters as he looks into the refrigerator. You need to cut out the leftovers, Paul. You're getting a little soft around the middle. A voice calls out.
Who? I'm calling the police.
Paul exclaims as he turns and discovered me sitting on the bench nearby. I introduce myself and inform Paul that I'm not here to hurt him. I just need his help. Also, I've cut your phone lines and disabled your alarm system. You're not calling anyone, I added. Paul is quick to tell me that he has a wife and a kid, that I can take whatever I wanted, but to not hurt his family. I ignored that, as I reminded Paul that 10 years ago, Cyclops saved his life, and I tell him that it is time for him to return the favor. I looked at a strange piece of red equipment that appears to be broken.
What is this? And how? I mean, what does this have to do with Cyclops?
Paul inquires. I explain that this is a Phoenix cage, or what is left of it. That the Avengers built it in an attempt to contain the Phoenix Force, only it didn't survive the encounter. And I need Paul to build a new one. Paul looks at the equipment and remarks that it looks very complex and there is a lot of it missing.
What makes you think?
Paul begins. Before I pointed at him and tell him that I know about him, that he was top of his class at MIT, one of Tony Stark's sharpest employees. I picked you for a reason, I added.
Trap the Phoenix Force. Is that even possible?
Paul asks, looking under the cage. I tell him that I don't know, and that it doesn't matter, as he doesn't need to trap the Phoenix Force. All I need is for Paul to build something that can siphon off a small portion of the Phoenix Force that is willingly running through it. You've got about 2 years to figure it out, I added, as I climb off the kitchen bench. Oh, and it has to be smaller, I announced.
How much smaller?
Paul asks. I hold my thumb and index finger about an inch apart. This small, I declared. See you in 2 years, I remarked, before I vanished, body sliding by one.
Wait, what? No, there's no way. Great.
Paul mutters. 2 years later, the first time Scott Summers died, Muir Island, where the rain beats down on a group of X-Men gathered to mourn the loss of Scott Summers. Cable, my older self, is there along with Magic, Iceman, Forge, Goldballs, and Beast. The time-displaced Marvel Girl, Iceman, and Angel are there too. Storm addresses them and remarks that life as a mutant sometimes feels like a constant fight for their species' survival against impossible odds. Watching from behind some rocks on a cliff nearby is me and Paul Douek, who utters,
He's really gone.
Yeah, I replied. Paul remarks that he knows that recently Cyclops had really gone off the rails and people hated him.
But I always had hope, you know? Hope that he'd somehow come to his senses. That he'd remember who he was. That he would wake up one day and be the same kid who saved my life in college.
I tell Paul that we don't have much time before we vanish as I body slided by 2. We reappear inside a dark lab on Muir Island, where the body of my dad has been placed on a table. Paul is confused.
If he's still here, then who are they burying out there?
He asks. Another of Emma Frost's mind games. I explain, declaring that Emma has perverted Cyclops' memory and used it to incite a war between mutants and the Inhumans. And now, she isn't even giving him the dignity of a proper burial. Let's get this over with, I suggested, as Paul opens a bag and pulls a tiny device from it. And you're certain this'll work? I asked.
No.
Paul replies. He pulls Cyclops' shirt down and reminded me that the Phoenix Force destroyed the Phoenix Cage, that he tried to account for the extra surge of power, but there was no way for him to properly test it.
In theory, it should work. However, it could just as easily overload and fail. Depends on the intensity of the Phoenix Force.
Paul explains as he slices a scalpel down Cyclops' muscular chest. I hold up the small device that Paul took from the bag and remark that last time the Phoenix Force was trying to protect itself. This time, it will be giving itself willingly. Several months ago, the second time Scott Summers died.
I thought about you every single day.
Jean Grey utters to Cyclops, the two of them embracing. Jean wears a black and red Phoenix costume. They lean in to kiss, and this sparks the small device inside Cyclops' chest. A small portion of the Phoenix Force entering the device.
I'll always love you, Jean Grey.
Cyclops vows.
I'll always love you too, Scott Summers.
Jean responds when suddenly, Cyclops gasps for breath and collapses, while the Phoenix Force hovers above him and Jean, and the device inside Cyclops' chest begins to glow. Several weeks ago, Scott crawls from his grave into puddles that form on the ground around him. "Welcome back," I called out. Scott looks up to see me standing over him. "Dad," I added, while Paul stands nearby, and the shocked Cyclops utters,
Cable?
"Shortly inside my safe house, which is at an undisclosed location."
Thank you.
Cyclops tells Paul, who hands him a cup of tea.
I don't know what to say.
Paul replies, while I lean against a counter nearby. Paul smiles.
When you saved my life all those years ago, I never thought I'd have the chance to pay you back. I still can't believe it worked.
Cyclops sips his tea and admits that he still isn't sure what happened. That the last thing he remembers is walking into the lab on Muir Island, and then he thinks he died.
But Jean was there. Only it felt like a dream. But it wasn't. Was it?
Scott asks, looking over at me. "The Phoenix Force brought you back in an attempt to convince Jean to stay with it." I explained, adding that Jean was too strong for it though, that she knew that it wouldn't let her be free. Paul informed Cyclops that they built a tiny machine made up of small infinity coils designed to siphon off power from the Phoenix Force, to store the Force, charging itself up until it could be focused.
It's pretty ingenious, if I can be so bold.
Paul adds,
We built this device and put it inside of you.
He reveals to Cyclops.
And bam, you're back. Just like that.
Paul points out.
Thank you.
Cyclops replies. Paul puts his hand on Scott and tells him thank you, reminding him that he saved his life, that he has a wife and a son.
If you hadn't saved me, I never would have been there for them. My son would never have known his father.
Paul adds, tears streaming down his face while Cyclops watches him. 1 week later, my dad has ditched his black and red costume and is wearing his dark blue costume with yellow trim.
I need to leave. I need to go see Jean.
He announces, but I tell him that he can't.
You can't keep me cooped up in here, Cable.
Scott replies. He tells me that he appreciates everything I have done for him, but that he has been gone too long and has to go. You're not ready yet, I replied as I examined one of my large weapons without even looking at my father.
Ready for what?
Cyclops asks, frustrated. You'll know when the time comes. I responded, putting my cloak on. I informed Cyclops I will be back, before body sliding by one and vanishing.
Damn it!
Cyclops shouts, slamming his fist down on a table. 1 week later, outside the Lancaster Maximum Security Correctional Center, in Shirley, Massachusetts.
You're a free man now, Tavin. Hope we never have to see you inside these walls again.
A prison guard calls out as the elderly Professor Tierney walks away from the prison. He sits on a bus that takes him to an old, run-down house. He stands outside the house and looks at it for some time before walking inside. It's dark, dusty, and full of cobwebs. He goes over to the door under the inside staircase. There is a padlock on it, but the lock is open.
Daddy's home.
Tierney calls out from the open door, which leads down to the basement.
Did you miss me?
Tierney asks as he walks down into the basement, which is a mess with computers, robots, and other equipment scattered throughout.
What? Someone's been here.
Tierney realizes as he finds a note stuck to one of the robots. The note has Paul's name and address on it. Back at my safe house, I handed my dad a root beer, as Cyclops remarks.
You sent the younger X-Men back to their own time. It's like I experienced it, like I was there.
Cyclops adds, informing me that he has his memories now, his younger self. They never should have been here in the first place. I replied.
And you killed Cable. You're older.
Cyclops begins. No, I responded. I pointed a finger on the table and leaned across to my father, declaring that I retired an older, less effective version of myself. The older me was screwing up. He let those kids stay here and the results could have destroyed the X-Men, destroyed entire futures. I prevented those possibilities because that's my job. I then knocked back my root beer and explained that I keep the timeline in order.
Then how come I'm not still dead?
Cyclops asks. Because, I begin to reply, turning away from Cyclops.
If you're so concerned with maintaining the timeline that you'd kill my son in order to fix it.
Cyclops begins. I am your son. I shouted before I upturned the table.
Why did you bring me back? I should still be dead.
Cyclops shout. Because it wasn't right, I exclaim, throwing my arms into the air. I covered my face with my hands as I tell my father, You're their leader, their hope. For you to die on your knees from a damned infection, from mist. That's not the way that should have gone down. I couldn't let it end that way. Cyclops watches me, then goes over to me, kneeling beside me. He tells me that I am right, and that given the chance to save someone he loved, then absolutely, he would have done whatever it takes.
But you can't keep me here. What's the point in bringing me back if you're just gonna hold me prisoner?
Scott asks. He moves away from me and points out that there are people out there who needs him, so I need to let him go. I looked up. Fine, I replied, before telling Cyclops that I need him to prove something to me first. I informed Cyclops that right now, the X-Men are fighting on an island in Canada. They are fighting the biggest threats they've ever faced. And they need all hands on deck. But if they fail, the X-Men will be no more. Cyclops frowns as he listens to this, while I tell him that in Boston, a madman is planning his revenge on Paul Douek, the man responsible for every bad thing that's ever happened to him, and the man who returned Cyclops to life. Saving one means failing the other. You have to choose. I announced.
No!
Cyclops replies, gritting his teeth. Then they all die. I pointed out.
You did this!
Cyclops asks. I tell him to choose.
Why would you?
Cyclops begins, to which I explained that I have to know what type of man came back from the grave. On Quadra Island, Canada, X-Man, in the body of Legion, he and his horsemen of salvation, Storm, Magneto, Blob, and Omega Red, battle Jean Grey, Iceman, Archangel, Nightcrawler, Colossus, Jubilee, Armor, and Glob. In Boston.
Run!
Paul calls out to his wife and son. Dad, what's happening? Paul's son asks. Paul calls his son Emmett and tells him that it is going to be okay, that he just needs to get to the basement, as Professor Tierney stands in the Douek's living room and declares,
13 years! 13 years of my life, of my work, all lost because of you.
Paul starts to close the basement door, telling Emmett to look after his mother while he tries and leads them away. Dad, no, you can't, Emmett calls out. But Paul tells his son that he needs him to be brave.
My family has nothing to do with this. You leave them alone.
Paul calls out, armed with the fire poker. He turns to face Professor Tierney, who has a dozen robots at his side and wears his strange helmet that enables him to command the robots. Tierney tells Paul that he is in no position to make demands.
You stole from me? I'm going to do the same to you.
He remarks, adding that he is going to make him watch as he does. Make him suffer for what he has done.
Robots! Bring his family to me.
Tierney frowns, when suddenly, one of the robots gets knocked aside by an optic blast.
I won't lie. That felt pretty damn good.
Cyclops announces as he stands in a gaping hole in the wall.
Cyclops!
Paul gasps.
Not you again.
Professor Tierney mutters, ordering his robots to attack.
You'd think after 13 years away, you'd find a way to hide your weakness.
Cyclops points out as he fires a blast at Tierney, knocking his helmet from his head. Tierney falls to the ground, and Cyclops remarks that some people never learn.
I can't believe it. You saved me again. Thank you.
Paul utters.
No, Paul. Thank you for bringing me back.
Cyclops replies. The next day, on the shore of Quadra Island, British Columbia, the flood has subsided, and my father and I stand with the water lapping at our feet. Cyclops recalls that the X-Men's fight with the Avengers had its first punch thrown on a beach.
Charles died. I killed Charles on a beach. And now, the X-Men are gone, vanished from this beach. If I never see another beach again for as long as I live.
Cyclops utters. He turns to me and tells me that he was furious. Furious that it looked like mutants were on the verge of extinction. Angry that the world they had spent their entire lives trying to protect could try to snuff them out like that.
After a life of trying to prove that we fit in, that mutants and humans should, live as one. I did the same thing that everyone I've been fighting had done. Put my species above theirs. I became the monster they feared.
Cyclops remarks, admitting that it was wrong, that he was wrong. He hangs his head and points out that now the X-Men are done. What are you gonna do about it? I asked. Cyclops looks out over the water. With me at his side, he announces that he is going to find the X-Men and set it right.